Hi everyone, it's B. This video takes you through how I made a 90s patchwork corset. I wanted to make something out of old clothes that I had around the house and blatantly milk the 90s, early 2000s Y2K trend that's coming back at the moment. I'm also drawing some inspiration from basic 17th century stays. Conversely, I also want to avoid this Victorian silhouette with a sweetheart style neckline. I also want patchwork that looks avant-garde, but at the same time doesn't make me look like I'm an extra in Les Miserables. With all that in mind, I'm going to get started. I start by drawing up some ideas on Critter, using the fabric colors that I have available to me. Then I iron out the lining fabric. This is just some simple cotton that will form the inside of the corset. Making the inner layer of the corset first allows me to perfect the shape of the corset and execute the design that I have in my head, which is different to what the pattern is. All of the corset pattern pieces, however, must be aligned to the grain of the fabric as specified in the pattern. I cut 2 pieces of each pattern to make the left and right sides of the lining. I also cut out fusible interfacing for each piece. This will be ironed onto the wrong side of each lining piece to add stability to the garment. Here, the pattern tells me to sew pieces 9 and 10 together to make this kind of wonky side front piece that doesn't actually make it in the end. However, it's best to follow the instructions of the pattern exactly before making any changes. Here I sew the front side piece, so piece number 8, to the side pieces 9 and 10. I then sew piece 8 to piece 7. I then sew the 2 7 pieces together to make the very front of the corset. Here are the back pieces of the corset. I sew these 3 pieces together to form each half of the back of the corset. I then pin and sew the back pieces of the corset to the front. And boom! Now the whole corset lining is sewn together. I can now iron it all out and try it on. Now for the adjustments. I want to flatten out the top of the corset because I just feel like the sweetheart neckline is very 2014 or 1950s. So I just go for this straight neckline that emulates a lot of 90s fashion or 17th century stays. Not only do I lower the top of the corset, I also add an armhole so it fits better. Then I make this long strap piece to elongate the back piece number 12. This strap is going to attach at the back and then make its way around the top of the shoulder to meet with the front. And now we have the neckline and straps modified. Note how the bottom protrudes out, we'll fix that later. This entire process is me retracing the pattern pieces to fit with the alterations I made. This is a pretty simple process, but it is unpleasant as the hand feel of the translucent synthetic pattern pieces is absolutely atrocious. I've pinned the corset to eliminate piece number 10 and therefore stop the bottom of the corset from protruding out. So piece number 9, it has to be narrowed as well, and also piece number 8 has to have some changes made to it too. I sew my adjustments as darts before committing to the new pattern piece shapes. I am now ready to start on the actual corset. I want each piece to have a unique patchwork construction. Here I make a large rectangular patchwork piece to cut the very front of the corset out. The key for this patchwork is to make sure each piece has the grain run in the same direction. I also decide to remove the seam in the very middle of the garment. Then I cut out the front of the corset. I then start the patchwork with piece number 8. This time I cut out some of the pattern before sewing it all together. I then work on piece 9. I get sick of this technique and decide to make a giant patchwork to cut all the back pieces out of. I keep all the grains running at the same direction by envisioning one large rectangle. At this stage, I wonder if making a giant patchwork was a mistake. Surely I did not sew as many concave corners as this, with 5 fabrics meeting when I did the front pieces. I cut most of the remaining pieces out of this sheet. I then sort out the colors for pieces 12 to match pieces 8. I want the straps to be the same color when they match up in the front. I cut out the remaining piece 12 out of solid fabric. I then begin to sew everyone together. This bit is super satisfying. Pieces 7, 8 and 9 are sewn together to form the front. I start on the back with pieces 11 and 12. Some of the fabric slides around a lot, hence the huge amount of pins. To complete the back, I sew piece 13 on. Then the whole corset is assembled by matching the front and back halves. The patchwork exterior looks super clean, I love it. I had to attach a piece to extend the back of the corset. I also had to add a channel for the grommets. I also lengthened one of the back straps as they are not quite even. I then iron each seam of the lining open. I stitch in the ditch down each of the seams. This secures each piece of the corset to the correct lining piece, as well as flattens each seam out. Though it is somewhat challenging to get it right on target, it is also super satisfying. Now it looks a little bit flatter compared to the last try on. I also sew along the entire top edge of the corset. This gives me a good idea of how the corset will look in the end, as well as prepares the corset for the binding that will finish the garment. Stitching along the perimeter also allows me to even out the corset with scissors, so it is perfectly symmetrical as well as sits flush with the lining. I then sew along the bottom of the corset. And instantly the corset takes shape. It's a lot more fitted and the patchwork just looks better and better with each step. I then add grommet channels to the back of the corset. It's time to trim away that excess lining. I sew the grommet channels to the corset. I leave the top and bottom of the channel unsewn, so I can insert binding onto the hems later. I then mark out the holes for the corset. For a variety of reasons, they don't turn out even, but they do the job. I start making holes for the corset. I follow this procedure for making 18th century thread grommets. The idea is to push the fibers out of the way to make the hole. So you start with a needle before moving on to bigger and bigger sticks to make a hole, without cutting any part of the fabric. At least that's the idea. Some fibers did get ripped, but I literally did not have time to coax each weave of cotton to not rip, lol. I laced the corset and tried it on. I'm pretty happy with how it fits so far. I then hand sew a blanket stitch around the perimeter of the grommets. This is easily the most difficult part, as these buttonholes wind up not being even, especially since I work with such thick fabric at the back. I also punch holes in the shoulders. Surprisingly, though they're all different fabrics, they all have a similar amount of give to them, so all the holes end up the same size. I managed to find the exact series of objects, where the largest diameter of the previous object, it was as big as the smallest diameter of the next. See how I start with a needle and then move on to a toothpick? I then use a 3.5mm crochet hook, and then finally the chopstick. It's several days later, and I've got my binding delivered. But it turns out trickier than I expected, because of all the tight curves I have to make with the binding. The bottom of the corset is pretty straightforward though. With these types of processes, it's always best to work on parts of the corset that would be the least noticeable first. This is so you can learn technique and tricks along the way. But honestly, nothing could have prepared me for the struggle of doing the top. There are a couple of sharp corners at the very middle of the corset that require some thought. I then work on the top of the corset. The massive amount of pins are essential here. After sewing the right sides together, I can flip this binding to cover the edge here. And then I sew the other side of the binding so it sandwiches the raw edge of the corset. I continue in this fashion until I finish the top of the corset. It's not perfect, but it'll do. Here's what this harrowing process looks like from my point of view. But yes, after this entire experience, I'm a little less addicted to bias binding. I feel like a posh polo player. Woo! I am a Regency woman going horse riding with my close female companion. I'm living the fantasy. I fold and top stitch the ends of the grommet channels in place, so everything's very neat now. I also double stitch the grommet channel to try and disguise the fact that the first line of stitching is a bit dodgy. I then lace the corset again, just so I can align the grommets and punch and sew the final 4 holes. After this, I turn off the camera, put on 2 episodes of The Crown and finish the corset because this part takes focus. And boom, we're finished.